Welcome everybody. I'm standing in front of St. Philip's Moravian Church, located in Old Salem, historic district of Winston-Salem, North Carolina. St. Philip's is one of the oldest African American churches in North Carolina, and one of the oldest African American congregations in the United States. Today we're going to be diving into the history of this site, as well as some of the ins and outs of historic preservation. I also have a local preservationist here from Forsyth Preservation to talk about some of the reasons why historic architecture and buildings are restored.
Hi, I'm Martha Knipe. I am a professional preservationist with Preservation Forsyth in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We are the county-wide preservation organization, and our mission is to educate about, advocate for, and preserve historic resources in Forsyth County. One of the earliest historic resources that we have in this county, as is nationally known, is what is called Old Salem Museum and Gardens, which was originally simply the town of Salem when the Moravians bought the Wachovia tract in about 1772. We are standing beside right now what was the original St. Philip's Moravian Church, which eventually was disintegrated because it was not preserved, it was not taken care of. This is a recreation of that particular church. In the last few years, Salem has started a wonderful initiative called Hidden Town, because the history of blacks in Salem, which goes back to the very first settlers in this town, had essentially been erased. There had been very little research done on that. And so these buildings are incredibly important. They are tangible artifacts that we can touch, that we can put our hands on. This particular building is very impressive in the fact that they were able to recreate this building according to descriptions in the Moravian, they call them diaries or their accounts. The Moravians were meticulous record keepers. So we had the records of exactly how this building was built, its size, all of that. As you can see, the logs here have been recreated with exactly the same construction techniques that you would have used in the 1700s. Salem has always had tradesmen and preservationists who knew how to maintain older buildings and also do reconstruction and repair like this. I find this very interesting as well. This is just basically a clay chinking in between these. This church, however, was built by the black community. So I can only assume that, and I'm sure that there's more information available other places, but this was done by black tradesmen. So one of the really important things about having a tangible structure like this is the materials, if this were original, and we happen to be standing as well beside the late 1800s church that was eventually built with what is clearly handmade brick. So were this an original building, and certainly at the other church, you're putting your hands on the original materials that were created at that time period. You're putting your hands on the marks or in the same place that the actual craftsmen, the tradespeople, had their hands as well. And that's really an amazing experience. The stone base here has been recreated as well, and this is clearly stone that has been reused from somewhere else, but it has been built in that same dry stacking methodology that you would have used at that point. So why do we preserve? What is the point of historic preservation? Well, we talk a lot in preservation about preserving the past, retaining the past, having these tangible artifacts from the past, bringing them into the present, being the ones in the present who are responsible for preserving and maintaining these buildings into the future, which of course includes adaptive reuse of many older buildings as well. But in this particular case with this church, The congregation moved a number of times, but the building was still here. The building has been empty for a long time. The congregation has now moved back, and they can because this building was still standing here. As you can see, here is a list of all of the black members of this Moravian church. And in the last couple of decades, ground penetrating radar was done in the yard, and they discovered all of these graves that surround the church. There also is what's called a stranger's graveyard here, and this was anyone who was non-Moravian. As it turns out, cemeteries fall under historic preservation. Historic cemeteries and historic preservation fall under the National Park Service. This particular building, you can see this wonderful, what we call curved hood up here. This is a very typical Moravian hood, and you can see the carved brackets. These are very plainly carved brackets. But one of the important things about preservation is to maintain the original materials if at all possible. Maintain the windows and the doors. Now, with the steps here, there's actually a marker that tells us that these steps were restored, well, rehabbed, I should say, in 2003. And I'm sure that they had to put this is obviously new granite. However, when you rehab something like this, you want it to look as much like the original as possible. And if it is possible to save the original materials, like this clearly hand-thrown brick and hand-mixed mortar, that's what you really want to do.
The restored log church, which sits beside the brick church, was the original home of the African American congregation. It was used from 1822 until 1861, when the church beside it, the brick church that we just saw, was built. The congregation, after it moved to the church in 1861, which has been preserved over here, and restored to its original look. The church was begun by Moravians to foster the spiritual life of the slaves who worked at Salem at the time, and before the church was built, the enslaved and whites used to worship together. But as Western ideologies were adopted, worship services were segregated. When the races were separated in life, they were also in death, as they were buried in the cemetery designated the Strangers Graveyard and the Negro Graveyard. The Strangers Graveyard was for members that were not, they were for people that were not Moravians. According to the Southern Province Archives, the seventh oldest church in the Southern Province, which is this church, the St. Philip's, was born as a mission to fill a great need. So in 1822, Salem's Female Missionary Society noted the absence of religious opportunity for the Negroes in this neighborhood, and urged the provincial elders conference to address the matter so that in the course of time, a church may be built for their own use. Hence, the African American log church and the brick building that was built in 1861. By the early 1800s, the Moravians segregated the cemeteries. They began burying the white strangers next to God's Acre, became Negro God's Acre, a burial ground for all people of color. In 1861, the Moravians built a new church for the black congregation along the fence of the line of the graveyard, but in 1890 they built onto the church, adding a room right over the graves. There are about 131 confirmed buried on the property. At least 12 stones were found under the steps of the church during its restoration. In 2018, ground penetrating radar was used to find remaining graves located in the Strangers Graveyard, number 2, which is behind the original, the church built in 1861, Many of these stones were damaged and weathered over time, and there were more than 200 graves found in this area. The current congregation of St. Philip's and Salem worked together to mark these graves and to find out who the people were, which is still an ongoing project today.